Well, the phrase "the miracle on the Han River," and of course the Han River referring to the main river that flows through the capital city of Seoul, is a phrase that I think only came into use, at least as far as I know, maybe in the 1990s or maybe even a little bit later. It was not something that anyone talked about when I first lived in Korea in the 1970s, or indeed when I was back there as a young diplomat in the 1980s at a time of great political turmoil and continuing economic growth. So I think looking back at, people call it a miracle, at the time, and I was there at a time of tremendous economic growth, but also at a time when, in the 1970s, when South Korea's GDP per capita, to the extent that measures something accurately, but it's a comparative measure, but its GDP per capita had only just surpassed North Korea's. At that time, nobody thought a miracle was taking place. I mean, it was more like blood, sweat, and tears. And it was a time of tremendous sense of shared sacrifice and hard work and compulsion even to try to build out of this terrible half-century of colonial occupation. Well, first of, I guess you'd say, imperial collapse with the end of the Korean dynasty that had led the country, ruled the country as a unified country, for centuries. But imperial collapse, colonial occupation by Japan, liberation immediately followed by division, and then a terrible war. I mean, it's hard to think of a more difficult, even in the difficult 20th century, it's hard to think of a country that suffered more insult after insult and sacrifice after sacrifice than Korea. So with all that behind it, what I saw in the early days of the building of what became known as the miracle on the Han was an absolute determination that first and foremost Koreans were going to make for their children a better lives than they had enjoyed. And secondly, that there was a sense of national need to demonstrate that South Korea was going to be able to survive and even prosper, notwithstanding the alternative, if you like, and system of North Korea, and also the continuing military threat that North Korea presented. So I attribute the success that Korea enjoyed first in the economic realm, but then importantly accompanied by democratization, by greater freedoms and expressiveness. I attribute that first and foremost to the determination of the Korean people, to a lot of respect for, I think, for expertise and facts and skill, and for, generally speaking, a competent governance. That is not to say that it was perfect, it certainly wasn't, but those combined, along with, I think, an important security guarantee from the United States and so the U.S. open markets, all contributed to an economy that grew, as I mentioned, from about $600 per capita GDP in the early 1970s to, when I returned to the 1980s on the cusp of the Seoul Olympics, to about 2,000 per capita GDP to something like 30,000 today. And within that, to then have it accompanied belatedly, in some people's minds, including my own, but belatedly by an equally impressive, if you like, miracle, because a lot of people didn't expect it would happen, but an equally impressive and hard-fought achievement of democracy.